The summer of 1887 blazed across the Texas plains with merciless intensity, but nothing burned hotter than the controversy surrounding Ezekiel "Zeke" Morrison's unprecedented newspaper advertisement. Posted in every major publication from Dallas to San Antonio, the bold black letters seemed to leap off the page. Wealthy rancher seeks bride. No dowry required. Character matters more than beauty. Come to Morrison Ranch, Cedar Creek, Texas, September 15th. Zeke stood on the wraparound porch of his sprawling ranch house, watching dust clouds rise from the horizon like smoke signals announcing the arrival of hope and desperation in equal measure. At 35, he was considered past his prime for marriage by frontier standards, but his 50,000-acre spread and rumored fortune made him the most eligible bachelor in 3 counties. The death of his business partner had left him not only wealthy beyond measure, but profoundly lonely. "Boss, there's got to be near 200 wagons coming up the main road," called out Jake, his foreman, squinting against the sun's glare. "And that's just what I can see from here." The reality was staggering. Women had traveled from as far as California and New York, drawn by tales of Morrison's cattle empire and the promise of security in an uncertain world. School teachers who'd lost their positions, widows struggling to feed their children, young women fleeing arranged marriages, and fortune hunters with calculating eyes. They all converged on the small town of Cedar Creek like moths to a flame. The local boarding house overflowed within hours. Families opened their homes to strangers for a fee. The general store ran out of supplies as women purchased new dresses, ribbons, and powders, each hoping to catch the rancher's eye. The town's single church organized prayer meetings, with the preacher beseeching divine guidance for what many saw as an unseemly spectacle. Ezekiel had spent the previous week in town, observing the arrivals with growing unease. He'd expected perhaps 50 responses to his advertisement, not this overwhelming tide of humanity. Each woman carried her own story of hardship, dreams pinned to the hope that a stranger might offer salvation from poverty, abuse, or simply the grinding loneliness of frontier life. "Mr. Morrison," called out Mary Beth Henderson, the banker's daughter, as she approached with practiced grace. "Daddy says you're the smartest businessman in East Texas. Surely you have a plan for all this?" Zeke's weathered hands gripped the porch railing as he watched families setting up camps along his property line. "I reckon I bit off more than I can chew, Miss Henderson. But a man's word is his bond. I said I'd meet with any woman willing to make the journey, and that's what I aim to do." The logistics were nightmarish. How could he possibly give fair consideration to what his foreman estimated might be close to 2,000 women? The town mayor had suggested a series of public presentations, like a county fair competition, but Zeke's stomach turned at the thought of reducing these women's hopes to spectacle. As evening approached, lanterns began flickering across the makeshift camps. The sound of children crying, women singing lullabies, and men arguing over territorial disputes created a symphony of human drama. Some women had brought entire families, viewing this as their chance to start fresh in Texas. Others traveled alone, carrying nothing but determination and a change of clothes. In the growing darkness, Zeke noticed a solitary figure sitting apart from the main groups. A woman in a faded black dress sat quietly beside a modest wagon, making no effort to socialize or position herself advantageously. Even from a distance, her stillness commanded attention, not the desperate energy of most arrivals, but something deeper, more substantial. "Jake," Zeke said quietly, "tomorrow's going to be the longest day of my life." The foreman chuckled grimly. "Boss, I'd rather wrestle a grizzly bear than deal with 2,000 women expecting miracles." As the first stars appeared over Texas, Ezekiel Morrison wondered if his quest for companionship had instead created the greatest challenge of his life. Chapter 2. The silent widow dawn broke over Cedar Creek with the gentle persistence of hope itself, revealing a sea of canvas tents, wagons, and makeshift shelters stretching across the Morrison property. The air hummed with anticipation as women prepared for what many considered the most important day of their lives. Cooking fires sent spirals of smoke into the clear sky, and the aroma of coffee and bacon began to compete with the dusty scent of the Texas plains. Margaret Maggie O'Sullivan had risen before dawn, as was her custom from years of managing a frontier homestead alone. She sat beside her weathered wagon, methodically braiding her auburn hair while observing the controlled chaos around her. At 28, she'd been widowed for 3 years, ever since cholera claimed her husband Patrick and their infant son during the harsh winter of 1884. Unlike the other women who clustered in excited groups, sharing strategies and primping for the day ahead, Maggie remained apart. She'd made the journey from Kansas not out of romantic fancy, but from practical necessity. Her small farm had failed after 2 years of drought, and the bank had foreclosed last month. This represented her final option, before accepting charity from relatives who'd made their disapproval of her marriage to an Irish immigrant painfully clear. "You're mighty calm for someone about to meet her potential husband," observed Clara Jensen, a young schoolteacher from Nebraska, who'd approached Maggie's wagon with genuine curiosity rather than the competitive suspicion most women displayed. Maggie looked up with eyes the color of storm clouds. "I suppose I've learned that life rarely unfolds according to our expectations, Miss Jensen. Better to face whatever comes with dignity than exhaust yourself chasing dreams." Clara settled beside her uninvited, drawn by Maggie's unusual composure. "That's a rather pessimistic view for someone who traveled 800 miles on the chance of finding love." "Love." Maggie's laugh held no bitterness, just weary realism. "I'm here seeking partnership, Miss Jensen. A chance to build something stable with someone who shares my values. Love, if it comes, would be a blessing, but it's not a requirement for a successful marriage." Meanwhile, Ezekiel had spent a sleepless night developing what he hoped was a fair process for meeting the enormous gathering of potential brides. Rather than the circus atmosphere many expected, he'd decided on individual conversations in the town's church, allowing each woman 15 minutes to speak privately with him. It would take days, but every woman deserved that courtesy. As morning progressed, the line forming outside the white clapboard church stretched nearly a quarter mile. Women had organized themselves according to some mysterious social hierarchy, with the most elaborately dressed and confident positioned at the front. Maggie, having no interest in such maneuvering, found herself near the very end of the line. "Lord have mercy," muttered Reverend Samuel Hayes as he surveyed the crowd from his church steps. "I've conducted weddings, funerals, and baptisms, but I've never seen anything quite like this." Inside the church, Ezekiel sat in the front pew, his Sunday clothes feeling stiff and formal. The first woman, a stunning blonde from New Orleans, swept in with practiced elegance, immediately launching into a rehearsed presentation about her accomplishments, family connections, and domestic skills. She was followed by a widow from Ohio who wept throughout her entire 15 minutes, overwhelmed by the magnitude of her circumstances. As the day wore on, Ezekiel heard variations of the same desperate themes. Women fleeing poverty, abuse, or social constraints, each hoping he represented salvation. Some were clearly fortune hunters, others genuinely kind souls seeking companionship. A few impressed him with their intelligence and strength, but none sparked the indefinable connection he hoped to find. The afternoon sun was slanting low when Maggie O'Sullivan finally entered the church. She moved with quiet grace, her simple black dress clean but clearly well worn. She didn't rush to fill the silence or launch into prepared remarks. Instead, she sat calmly in the pew across from him and waited. "Mrs. O'Sullivan," Ezekiel said, consulting the paper where she'd written her name. "Tell me about yourself." "I'm a widow, Mr. Morrison. I farmed 40 acres in Kansas until the drought and bank took it from me. I can cook, sew, manage accounts, and I'm not afraid of hard work. I'm here because I need security, and I imagine you need someone who won't spend your money foolishly or fill your house with drama." Her directness caught him off guard. "That's refreshingly honest. Most of the ladies today have talked about love at first sight and romantic dreams. Dreams are luxury items, Mr. Morrison. I deal in practical realities." For the first time in 2 days, Ezekiel found himself genuinely curious about the woman sitting across from him. Chapter 3. The Choice That Surprised Everyone. The final day of interviews arrived with an autumn chill that seemed to mirror the growing tension in Cedar Creek. Word had spread that Ezekiel Morrison would announce his decision at sunset from the church steps, and the entire town buzzed with speculation. Betting pools had formed among the local men, with odds heavily favoring the more glamorous candidates who'd made spectacular impressions during their brief meetings. Ezekiel spent the morning walking his property alone, wrestling with a decision that would affect not just his future, but the hopes of nearly 2,000 women. He'd narrowed his choices to 5 candidates: Elizabeth Hartwell, a refined widow from Boston with impeccable manners and education; Sarah Mitchell, a spirited rancher's daughter from Colorado who understood cattle and horses, Amanda Foster, a young beauty from Charleston whose charm had captivated half the town, Catherine Reynolds, a practical nurse from Chicago with steady nerves and a kind heart, and Margaret O'Sullivan, the quiet widow whose straightforward honesty had lingered in his thoughts for 3 days. "Boss," Jake approached cautiously, recognizing the weight on his employer's shoulders. "The whole county's holding its breath. Even the newspapers from Dallas sent reporters." Ezekiel paused beside the oak tree where he'd proposed to his first love 20 years ago, before consumption claimed her life. "Jake, what makes a marriage work, really work, through drought and prosperity, sickness and health?" The foreman considered the question seriously. "Respect, I reckon, and someone who'll tell you the truth even when you don't want to hear it. My Martha and I, we've had our share of troubles, but we never lied to each other about the hard things." As afternoon shadows lengthened, the crowd gathered in the town square grew restless. Many women had already begun packing, sensing their chances had passed. Others primped frantically, hoping for a last-minute opportunity to change the rancher's mind. The 5 finalists sat in the front row of chairs arranged before the church, each maintaining careful composure, while their hearts hammered with anticipation. Maggie O'Sullivan sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, watching children play between the wagons. She'd made peace with whatever decision came. If chosen, she'd give her best effort to build a partnership with this man she barely knew. If rejected, she'd take the job offer she'd received from the town's general store owner, who needed someone to manage his books and help with his elderly mother. At precisely 6 o'clock, Ezekiel emerged from the church and stood on the steps. The crowd fell silent. Hundreds of faces turned toward him with desperate hope. Reporters raised their pencils, ready to record this unprecedented moment in Texas history. "Ladies," he began, his voice carrying clearly in the still air, "3 days ago I thought I was simply looking for a wife. Instead, I've been humbled by the courage and strength of every woman who made this journey. Each of you deserves happiness and security, and I wish I could provide that for all of you." Murmurs rippled through the crowd as women held their breath. "After careful consideration, I've chosen to propose marriage to Mrs. Margaret O'Sullivan of Kansas." The announcement hit like thunder. Gasps echoed across the square, followed by a stunned silence. Elizabeth Hartwell's face flushed with indignation, while Sarah Mitchell nodded with grudging respect. Several women in the crowd burst into tears, their dreams crumbling in the dust of the Texas plains. Maggie herself seemed frozen, her storm-gray eyes wide with shock. She hadn't allowed herself to hope, hadn't dared to imagine being chosen over so many seemingly superior candidates. "Mrs. O'Sullivan," Ezekiel continued, stepping down from the church and approaching her chair, "would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The crowd pressed closer, desperate to hear her response. Maggie stood slowly, her legs unsteady beneath her. For a moment that felt like eternity, she studied the man before her, weathered hands that spoke of honest work, eyes that held both strength and kindness, a face marked by responsibility rather than easy living. "Mr. Morrison," she said quietly, her voice somehow carrying to every corner of the square, "I accept your proposal, with the understanding that we're entering a partnership based on mutual respect and shared goals rather than romantic fantasy." A collective exhale swept through the crowd, followed by scattered applause and more than a few sobs of disappointment. The reporters scribbled frantically, already composing headlines about the shocking choice that had defied all expectations. As the crowd began to disperse, Elizabeth Hartwell approached Maggie with barely controlled fury. "I don't understand his choice. You have nothing to offer. No beauty, no breeding, no fortune." Maggie met her gaze steadily. "Perhaps that's exactly what he was looking for, Miss Hartwell. Someone who wants partnership, more than privilege." Chapter 4. The Wedding and New Beginnings. The wedding of Ezekiel Morrison and Margaret O'Sullivan took place 1 week later, on a crisp October morning that painted the Texas sky in shades of gold and amber. Despite the unconventional courtship, or perhaps because of it, the entire town of Cedar Creek turned out for the ceremony. Many of the disappointed suitors had departed, but several hundred remained, curious to witness the conclusion of the most talked-about romance in Texas history. Maggie had spent the week in the boarding house, getting to know her future husband through carefully chaperoned conversations. They discussed practical matters, the running of the ranch, financial arrangements, expectations for their shared life. What surprised her was discovering Ezekiel's quiet intelligence and dry sense of humor beneath his serious exterior. "You realize," she told him during one of their walks around town, "that people expect this marriage to fail. They think you chose poorly." "Let them think what they want," Ezekiel replied, adjusting his pace to match hers. "I chose a woman who won't spend my money on fripperies, won't fill my house with drama, and won't lie to me when times get hard." "That seems like choosing very well indeed." The wedding dress had been a gift from an unexpected source. Clara Jensen, the schoolteacher from Nebraska, who'd befriended Maggie during the selection process. She'd purchased ivory silk from the general store and worked with several other disappointed suitors to create a simple but elegant gown that suited Maggie's understated style. "Why are you being so kind?" Maggie asked as Clara fitted the dress the night before the wedding. "You could have been chosen yourself." Clara's smile held no bitterness. "Because watching you these past days, I've seen something remarkable. You're not trying to become someone else to please him. You're simply being yourself, and that's what he chose. There's a lesson in that for all of us." The ceremony itself was held in the same church where the interviews had taken place, creating a sense of poetic completion. Reverend Hayes performed the service with dignity and warmth, despite his continued bewilderment at the circumstances that had brought the couple together. Maggie walked down the aisle alone, having no family present to give her away. She wore Clara's ivory dress with her mother's simple gold cross at her throat, the only jewelry she possessed. Her auburn hair was arranged in a loose chignon, adorned with wildflowers that Jake's wife Martha had gathered from the prairie. Ezekiel waited at the altar in his best black suit, watching his bride approach with an expression of quiet satisfaction. When she reached his side, he offered his arm with old-fashioned courtesy, and she accepted it with equal grace. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Hayes began, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Ezekiel Morrison and Margaret O'Sullivan in holy matrimony. This couple has come together not through convention, but through honest recognition of their mutual needs and compatible temperaments. The vows they exchanged were traditional, but both bride and groom spoke them with deliberate intention rather than rote recitation. When Ezekiel slipped a simple gold band onto Maggie's finger, she felt the weight of commitment settling around her like a mantle she was prepared to wear with honor. The reception was held in the town hall, with the entire community contributing food and decorations. Jake had surprised everyone by revealing hidden musical talents, playing fiddle while his wife Martha called square dances. Even some of the remaining marriage candidates joined the celebration, their initial disappointment giving way to genuine wishes for the couple's happiness. As evening approached, Ezekiel and Maggie climbed into his wagon for the ride to Morrison Ranch, now their shared home. The autumn air carried the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves, and the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "Are you nervous?" Ezekiel asked as they drove through the gathering dusk. Maggie considered the question honestly. "I'm apprehensive about the unknown, but not afraid. We've been honest with each other about our expectations. That's more than many couples can claim." The ranch house appeared ahead of them, its windows glowing with lamplight that Martha had kindly arranged. It was larger than any home Maggie had ever lived in, but the wraparound porch and sturdy construction spoke of permanence and shelter rather than ostentation. "Welcome home, Mrs. Morrison," Ezekiel said as he helped her down from the wagon. For the first time since accepting his proposal, Maggie smiled with genuine warmth. "Thank you, Mr. Morrison. I believe we're going to do just fine." Chapter 5. Love Found in Unexpected Places. Final chapter. 2 years had passed since the legendary bride selection of 1887, and the Morrison Ranch had transformed into something neither Ezekiel nor Margaret could have imagined during their practical courtship. The autumn of 1889 brought not only the golden beauty of the Texas plains, but also the quiet satisfaction of a partnership that had exceeded all expectations. Maggie stood on the wraparound porch, her hand resting on her rounded belly, where their first child grew beneath her heart. The morning sun caught the copper highlights in her hair, now worn longer and softer than the severe style she'd maintained as a struggling widow. She watched Ezekiel working with the horses in the corral, his movements confident and sure, and marveled at how completely their lives had intertwined. "Mrs. Morrison," called Clara Jensen from the garden gate, her voice bright with affection. The schoolteacher had accepted a permanent position in Cedar Creek and had become Maggie's closest friend. The Ladies' Aid Society is meeting this afternoon to plan the church social. Will you be joining us? Maggie smiled, still amazed at how naturally she'd found her place in the community. Of course, I promised to bring my apple preserves and the recipe for Martha's biscuits. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. The first months of marriage had required careful navigation as two independent people learned to share space, decisions, and dreams. Ezekiel had been patient with Maggie's initial reserve, understanding that trust would come gradually. Maggie had been equally patient with his occasional awkwardness in domestic matters, having lived alone for so many years. The turning point had come during their first Christmas together. A blizzard had trapped them in the house for 3 days, forcing conversations that went beyond the practical discussions of ranch management and household duties. Ezekiel had shared his dreams of building a legacy that would outlast him, while Maggie had spoken of her fear of losing another family to circumstances beyond her control. "I chose you," he'd told her during those snowy days, "because you understood that love isn't just passion and poetry. It's showing up every day, especially when things get difficult." "And I chose you," she'd replied, "because you offered partnership instead of promises you might not be able to keep." Somewhere between those honest conversations and the spring branding season, when Maggie had surprised everyone by proving remarkably capable with the cattle, their practical arrangement had blossomed into something deeper. Love had crept in quietly, built on foundation stones of respect, trust, and shared goals. Now, as Ezekiel approached the porch, his face lighting up at the sight of his wife, Maggie felt the familiar warmth that had become as natural as breathing. He climbed the steps and kissed her forehead, his hand joining hers on her growing belly. "How are my two favorite people this morning?" he asked, the tenderness in his voice still capable of surprising her. "Your son is apparently training to be a bronc rider," Maggie replied with mock severity. "He's been kicking since dawn." "Son?" Ezekiel raised an eyebrow with amusement. "You seem very certain about that." "A mother knows these things," Maggie said with the confidence she'd gained over their 2 years together. "Just as I knew you were the right choice, even when everyone else thought you were making a mistake." They settled into the porch swing that Ezekiel had built during their first spring together, watching the ranch hands begin their daily routines. Jake waved from the barn, his weathered face creased with satisfaction at seeing his boss so content. The older cowboy had become something of a local legend himself, having predicted the success of the unusual marriage when everyone else expected disaster. "I received a letter from Elizabeth Hartwell yesterday," Maggie mentioned casually. "She married a banker in Dallas and wanted to thank me for stepping aside." Ezekiel chuckled. "Stepping aside? As I recall, she stepped aside when I chose you. She's learned some humility, it seems. Marriage has that effect on people." Maggie leaned against her husband's shoulder, still marveling at how perfectly she fit there. She also mentioned that several other women from that week found husbands in the area. "Apparently our wedding convinced some of the local bachelors that the selection process wasn't entirely mad. The legacy of their unconventional courtship had indeed rippled through the community." Cedar Creek had gained a reputation as a place where practical partnerships could flourish, attracting settlers who valued substance over sentiment. The town had grown and prospered, with new businesses and families arriving monthly. As the sun climbed higher, painting the Texas landscape in shades of gold and green, Maggie reflected on the journey that had brought her from desperate widow to contented wife and soon-to-be mother. The woman who had sat silently beside her wagon 2 years ago, expecting nothing and hoping for little, had discovered that sometimes the best dreams were the ones you never dared to dream. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked Ezekiel quietly. "Choosing the woman in the corner instead of one of the beauties who threw themselves at your feet?" Ezekiel was quiet for a moment, his hand stroking her hair with gentle reverence. "Maggie Morrison, you were never in the corner. You were exactly where you belonged, waiting for a man smart enough to recognize that real beauty comes from strength, honesty, and the courage to build something lasting." As if in agreement, their unborn child kicked vigorously, making both parents laugh. In the distance, the cattle moved peacefully across the pastures. The land stretched endlessly under the vast Texas sky, and the Morrison Ranch continued its quiet testament to the power of choosing partnership over passion, substance over superficiality. The story that had begun with a desperate advertisement and shocked a state with its conclusion had become something simpler and more profound. A love story written not in grand gestures and romantic declarations, but in the daily choice to honor commitment, support each other's dreams, and build a future worthy of the trust they'd placed in each other. Margaret O'Sullivan Morrison, the silent widow who had asked for nothing more than security, had found instead a love that would last lifetimes, and in the growing life beneath her heart, the promise that their story would continue for generations to come.